From the Institute for Research on Public Policy, this is Demystifying Community Housing, a special series from the Policy Options podcast in collaboration with Community Housing Canada. I'm your host, Ricardo Montrose. Demystifying Community Housing is recorded on the territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people, and the Kanien'kehá:ka Nation. We've also had the honor of speaking with guests located on Treaty 6 territory, the traditional lands of First Nations and Métis people, Treaty 4 territory, encompassing the lands of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dakota, Nakota, Lakota, and on the homeland of the Métis Nation, and on the traditional territories of the Musqueam, Squamish, and Tsleil-Waututh people. In this last episode of our series, our co-hosts Hanan and Natasha Mhuriro talked with four guests: Djaka Blais, Robert Byers, Joshua Evans, and Franz Bernhardt. Through those conversations, we spent time thinking about and imagining alternative models of community housing. How different could or should Canada's community housing sector look in the future? What are some good examples of innovating housing projects and practices from across the country and around the world? What lessons can we learn? These are all questions that will be touched on in this episode. I'll leave you with Hanan and Natasha to start the conversation.
Hello, listeners. Welcome back to the Demystifying Community Housing podcast series. I'm Natasha, one of your co-hosts.
And I'm Hanan, your other co-host. We're pleased to present you with episode 5, the final episode of the series. It's been quite the journey, hasn't it?
It certainly has. There's so much to learn about community housing. So far, we've covered the sector's evolution and its current landscape, as well as some of its challenges and opportunities.
Let's now turn to the future. What could community housing look like in Canada years or decades from now? What lessons can we learn from domestic and international examples? Joining the conversation today are 3 guests from different parts of Canada and one from Denmark.
Hanan, before getting into the future, let's do a brief recap of our current housing system, which some may argue is broken.
Yeah, let's start with the bigger picture. In previous episodes, we've talked about how Canada has a dualist housing system. This means there's a structural divide between the home ownership and rental sectors, and within the rental sector, a divide between the market and community housing. In this dualist system, there's a hierarchy of housing tenure, with ownership at the top and non-market rental at the bottom. Renting is seen as this temporary state that should come to a permanent end when renters become homeowners.
That's so true. Everyone is expected to participate in the private market to obtain housing and work hard to climb the housing ladder from renting to owning. And so the community housing sector only serves as the last resort for those left behind by the private market. So this creates a siloed community housing sector considered inferior to home ownership and the for-profit rental markets.
Exactly. Some call it a residualized system, meaning the community housing sector mainly targets the most vulnerable populations. Our first guest, Joshua Evans, talked about the consequences of having a dualist housing system. He is an associate professor of human geography at the University of Alberta. His research focuses on issues of housing, homelessness, and urban policymaking.
So I think one of the obvious implications of a dualist rental sector is that it tends to segregate households based on socioeconomic standing. So if we think about Canada's dualist rental sector, where we have, a large private rental sector and a much smaller and sometimes what's called a residual social housing sector that's houses households with lower incomes. This risks contributing to the already prevalent social stigma that's directed towards people with lower incomes. And so that's one of the obvious, implications that comes to mind for me. But I also think about the implications of this dualist rental system with regards to home ownership and the pronounced tenure inequality that exists in countries like Canada. So the inequality between the wealth of homeowners versus renters, for instance. So in Canada, private rentals are seen to be a pathway towards eventual home ownership. So it's tended to be viewed as somewhere people only stay for a short period in their lives, but eventually move on. But what we're seeing in Canada and many other countries, I would include Australia in this list, what we're seeing is that as home prices decouple from local incomes and home ownership becomes out of reach for more and more people, fewer and fewer renters are leaving the rental sector. And this is increasing demand in the rental sector, which is pushing up rents. And this is often to the detriment of those lower income households. So for this reason, this part of the market becomes highly lucrative as well for investors who are seeking profits. And they become what Ricardo Tranjan calls the tenant class, if you've read his book. So this is one of the biggest consequences in my opinion. And it's dynamics like this, and particularly how they affect housing affordability, it's dynamics like this that impinge upon the right to adequate housing.
The dualist system seems fundamental to the housing crisis because it worsens wealth and class inequality instead of supporting social and residential mobility.
You're right. Robert Byers, another one of our guests, reminded us of colonialism underpinning this homeownership ideology. European settlers in the colonial era not only displaced indigenous peoples from their traditional lands, but also imposed Eurocentric values of property rights and ideals of homes, and destroyed communal forms of living followed by many indigenous cultures. And this legacy of colonialism is alive and well. Robert Byers is president and CEO of Namerind Housing Corporation, an indigenous-led housing organization based in Regina, Saskatchewan. He shared with us an anecdote that clearly illustrates the persistence of systemic colonialism and racism in housing.
It's about 12 years ago that we had this idea of being a part of the revitalization of downtown Regina. So we, through a competitive bid process, bid on an abandoned building that was owned by the provincial government. They wouldn't just sell it to us, it had to be a competitive bid. We won that. Then we went to the city and we purchased an adjacent piece of property. Then we were told we had to knock down the abandoned building. Okay, so we did that. We turned it into a temporary parking lot. Now, since 2012, we've been trying to put together funds to build the project. We haven't been successful. Now, this fall, we were in a meeting. It was one put on by the City of Regina. And there wasn't just City of Regina folks, it was people, developers and such that live here or work here or develop here. And there was somebody in the meeting that said, I will tell you why your project won't work. And we just, okay. And he said, it's because nobody wants more Indians downtown. When there's a number of Indians living together, you guys need a high level of security. You guys are susceptible to prostitution and drug addiction, and nobody wants that. And it was quiet. I mean, we didn't say anything either, which maybe was a fault of ours. We just sort of sat there dumbfounded. And then they carried on and they adjourned the meeting, and I was thinking, nobody said anything. Nobody said anything. And then I get an email from the organizer that said, sorry about that. I should have said something. And I thought, yeah, I should have too. And then I felt like saying something to her, but I didn't. But even her apology was only to me. It wasn't to anybody else in the meeting. And I just thought, holy smokes, people are okay with this.
The experience of racism is also prevalent among Black communities. Our next guest is Djaka Blais, Executive Director of Hogan's Alley Society, a Vancouver-based nonprofit focusing on Black communities. She detailed examples of common anti-Black racism and discrimination in the housing sector, and how the lack of race-based data makes advocacy work particularly challenging.
So the Hogan's Alley Society Housing Solutions Lab, which was funded by CMHC, the big part of it was our quantitative and qualitative research that we conducted. So Black renters, speaking to significant amounts of anti-Black racism and housing discrimination that they are facing. their experience of anti-Black racism is not limited to just, one avenue, but really whenever trying to secure or retain housing, that 80% of the respondents spoke to experiencing anti-Black racism in that experience. The research also found that Black renters face some of the highest rent burdens, regardless of their living arrangements. There was also a lack of housing options, and with Black communities often being in either intergenerational living situations or potentially having larger family sizes, they were facing challenges in finding suitable housing as well as accessible housing that would meet the various visible and invisible disability that folks are living with. We also heard from folks working in the housing sector also experiencing anti-Black racism in the workplace. And so that just trickles down then to the clients that are being served in those organizations, and all the more promotes the need for culturally informed services that are targeting specific communities, as well as discriminatory government policies and the lack of disaggregated race-based data collection really having a significant impact on the services that are being designed and delivered for our communities. The other piece is, just constantly needing to address how anti-Black racism shows up more broadly in the housing sector, and that you're kind of having to, as an organization, justify our existence, just as Black people are having to justify our presence in this society. And so that really gets at the root of what our challenges are, is, yes, there are some really amazing leaders that are taking targeted equity-based approaches to how they work with organizations. And we also need to see that more significantly at the government level, at all three levels.
The housing problems Canada faces are severe, but by no means unique. The residualization of community housing has been a common theme across Europe in recent decades, indicated by lower supply and increasingly selective eligibility criteria for social housing access. Yet some countries have been able to fight these pressures. Joshua compares countries with a dualist rental system to those with a unitary system.
What we might be asking here is, how could we break out of this dualist rental system that we have in Canada? But just to take a step backwards, when we're talking about the dualist rental sector, my mind goes to the work of Jim Kemeny, who is a housing scholar. And in the 1990s, he wrote about the dualist system, which is effectively a system where you have a large private rental sector and a much smaller residual social rental sector that provides housing based on social need. And importantly, the social rental sector does not compete with the private rental sector, right? It has its own little niche in as far as who it serves. And Kemeny contrasted this with what he called the unitary system. And a unitary system, in contrast, has an equal proportion of private rental and social rentals, and they compete with each other. And the social rental sector receives kind of the same state subsidies. But what you find in countries with a unitary system is much more balance in the rental sector. So in countries like the Netherlands, for instance, there's actually a much larger social rental sector than there is a private rental sector. Countries like France comes to mind, which around 62% of households in France are homeowners, which is a little less than Canada, but not too far off. However, if you look at the rental market, 18% of households are renting at market price and 18% of households are renting at a reduced or subsidized price. So it's split, and it resembles something more like a unitary system. Similarly, in Finland, 63% of people in Finland are homeowners, but you look at the rental sector and it's split almost 50-50 again, 18% rent at market rates and 17% rent at a subsidized rate. So those are examples of alternatives to the dualist rental system. Another alternative, which goes a little further, might be countries that have come closer to universal homeownership. So I'm thinking about countries like Singapore, for instance, where an overwhelming number of households own their homes, but in a very particular way, in a way that's highly subsidized by the state, within a system where land is treated very differently than it is in countries like Canada.
So a unitary or integrated rental sector is one where the non-market sector can exert downward pressure or stabilizing effects on market rents, right?
Yeah, typically some key characteristics of a unitary rental market is that it becomes an attractive or comparable alternative to home ownership, provides a high degree of tenure security, and retains a large proportion of households, including better off ones.
That's very interesting. The existence of a unitary rental sector in other countries seems to challenge the idea that community housing can only serve and should only serve the most vulnerable populations.
Exactly. The share of our community housing in Canada's total housing stock is only around half the average level of 6.9% among countries belonging to the OECD, the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. With such a small sector, it makes sense to prioritize those with the greatest need. But the international cases Joshua mentioned are great examples of alternative systems where the community housing sector is larger and access is broader.
Indeed. Recently, both the Canadian Housing and Renewal Association and Scotiabank have called for doubling the community housing stock to bring it to the OECD average level. The question is, how can we modernize, transform, and expand the sector?
That's right. We could look to best practices in countries with a more integrated social housing sector, such as Denmark, the Netherlands, and Austria. We won't have time to cover all these countries, but our guest, Franz Bernhardt, who's a postdoctoral researcher in human geography at Copenhagen's Aalborg University, helped us do a bit of a deep dive into social housing in Denmark.
Denmark would be a super interesting case to look at. Its population is slightly larger than British Columbia, although it has more densely populated urban areas than BC.
Right. Denmark also has one of the largest community housing sectors among OECD countries, accounting for 21% of its total housing stock. Franz gave us an overview of the sector.
Denmark is quite a small country, roughly 6 million inhabitants, but in Denmark there are 800 of those non-for-profit housing associations in roughly 8,000 branches and with a total of more than 500,000 units. So it provides housing for nearly 1/5 of the population.
What Franz described there is non-profit-owned and managed housing, or almenebolige in Danish. Denmark also has a substantial amount of limited equity co-op housing, or andebolige, where residents own shares and can sell the shares at a price below a set maximum. Such co-op housing accounts for about 7% of Denmark's total housing stock. Some scholars point out that nonprofit and co-op housing have replaced private rental housing as the main alternative to owner-occupied housing in Denmark, making it a great example of an integrated housing system.
So the community housing stock in Denmark is even larger if we account for these limited equity co-ops?
Yeah, but we'll mainly focus on nonprofit housing today. Scholars describe the Danish nonprofit housing sector as an association-based model, meaning non-market housing is mostly owned and operated by independent nonprofit housing associations or organizations.
In Denmark, the social housing sector, which is very specific in the sense that it's mainly non-for-profit housing associations, but that are private. So they're not state, unlike in other European countries, let's say United Kingdom or Sweden, where local authorities quite often took command of social rental housing. Danish social renting housing is different in that sense. So that specific form is called almenebolige, and it's association-based models. And they maintain a financial independence, and they remain quite independent. So they're publicly subsidized and regulated, but they are independent in that sense.
Hanan, we know in Canada, access to community housing is highly selective and narrowly targeted. What is access like in Denmark, given the larger size of the sector?
It's quite different. Historically, the Danes had universal access to nonprofit housing with no upper income limits. However, that universalism has slightly eroded over time due to growing demand for affordable housing. Residualization is happening, but to a lesser extent in Denmark than in other European countries, such as Sweden and the UK. Franz explains this further.
It's sort of a full-blown social housing sector in the sense that, a bolige is, how to put it, a non-for-profit sector that offers housing for everyone, regardless of the financial situation. And it's something that's actually quite reiterated. So it's basically anyone who wishes to put their name on a waiting list can join. And sort of it's not means tested. So there are sort of means of support. So rent subsidies that are sort of available from the side of the states for, let's say, low-income families, students, pensioners, and whatever. And there is a certain demographic makeup of sort of who uses and who lives in those neighborhoods. But generally speaking, anyone who wants to put their name on a list can join. Municipalities allocate 25% of social rental units. That's in a law. So the non-for-profit housing, 25% is through the municipality for social housing purposes. But that still means most vacancies, 75% are distributed via waiting lists, where it's basically non-means tested. So, but it is an important element there. So the needs-based social rental is clearly more of a residual, selective one in that sense.
Franz further explains a growing concentration of poverty and immigration in the sector, and how recent legislation, the Ghetto Law or Parallel Societies Law, has threatened many nonprofit housing projects in designated areas where most residents are considered to have low social and economic status, or where most residents are deemed to be, quote, non-Western immigrants and their children.
What does non-Western even mean?
The Danish government defines Western countries to be all EU member countries and a dozen of other selected countries, including but not limited to the UK, Canada, the US, and Australia. And all other countries would be considered non-Western.
Wow, that's quite shocking.
Yeah, this law is highly controversial to say the least, and can force targeted housing associations to demolish, convert, or even sell their buildings.
So, of course, yes, there has been a trend since it is that there has been sort of, if you want to call it, less diversity in the sort of socioeconomic, even though this has been greatly exaggerated by people who really push the ghetto law. But yes, this has been. So yes, with increasing migration and so on, this has been that it served a bit more the needs for, let's call it the marginalized, so to speak. Yes, so this is definitely one piece of the puzzle. And then it's very much, I think, more that it has been sort of a state-led, in Denmark, at least a state-led production of spatial stigmatization. And in a weird way, I think it feels a bit like that it has become a new way of actually, of particular societal actors, of particular politicians, of particular people who have an interest in privatization, in sort of turning housing into a profit.
This ghetto law definitely has the potential to undermine the Danish community housing system and is something worth watching. Just as in Canada and other parts of the world, housing in Denmark is a highly contested political issue.
That's true, and the impacts of this recent legislation are still unfolding. But looking back in history, Denmark's nonprofit housing sector has consistently resisted state attempts to privatize and commodify it.
In the early 2000s, when, interestingly, these sort of, there were several attempts of kind of weakening the non-for-profit housing sector from various Danish governments. And these kind of trying to implement right-to-buy schemes in sort of a traditional manner with regards to the UK sort of did not work. It was not very effective. The research shows that it is, in comparison, very, very resilient to attempts on right-to-buy, of privatization, of broader processes of neoliberalization in the housing market.
According to the research Franz mentioned, when the Danish government introduced the right-to-buy policy in 2004, it estimated about 5,000 nonprofit units would be sold during a 3-year trial period, but it turned out only 62 units were sold. So the growth of their nonprofit housing sector remained robust after that, despite the commodification initiative.
The Danish nonprofit housing model is quite impressive in terms of the size of this sector and its resilience against the imposition of market-oriented housing policies. What lessons can we draw from that?
Well, you might recall that in earlier episodes, we discussed some challenges within Canada's community housing sector, including the difficulties nonprofits have with gaining access to financing, as well as the fragmentation of the sector with no overarching governance framework. A key feature of the Danish system is a sector-based centralized funding agency that ensures a high degree of financial independence for housing associations.
I think if you compare it to other social housing models, and I think there's several elements to, first of all, that it is independent housing associations that are not state-controlled, that they're independently funded, but that they're collective. I think that is actually the even more important element, that they are private but collective housing associations, and more importantly, that the concept of collecting rent is not to extract a surplus. I think that's what makes it so mainly important.
Central to the sector's sustainability is a stable financing model. Denmark has what's called a National Building Fund, a self-governing institution that supports the self-financing of nonprofit housing. It is operated outside the state budget and funded by a share of rent revenues of participating nonprofit housing organizations. Nearly all housing associations in Denmark are members of and contribute to the fund, which then serves as a savings account for the entire sector and helps finance renovations of existing nonprofit housing stock and co-finances new construction.
This independent but centrally managed financing model is interesting. What about the financing for new nonprofit housing?
That's a great question. Housing associations use commercial loans with some state subsidies and guarantees to cover about 80 to 90% of the costs of their new projects. The National Building Fund pays back a share of the state subsidies. Another 8 to 12% are covered by municipal loans that are interest-free and installment-free. Tenants also pay deposits to cover about 2% of the costs, and those deposits are returned to tenants at the end of their tenancy, minus expenses for normal repairs and any violations of the rental agreement, of course.
Based on discussions in our previous episodes, break-even rents or cost-based rents seem to be important for making a community housing project financially viable. How are rents determined in Denmark?
Denmark's nonprofit housing rents are set at a level that covers the upfront building costs, financing, and operational costs. Rents are adjusted annually based on inflation for the first 20 years, and once the loans are repaid, rents stay at that same level, with the amount that used to go to loan repayment instead are used to pay for things like renovations and repairs.
This may help explain why nonprofit rents in Denmark are not so affordable relative to other OECD countries.
Yeah, this goes back to our discussion in other episodes about why some form of subsidy is needed to create deeply affordable housing. However, affordability is only one aspect of adequate housing. Another distinct feature of Denmark's social housing system is tenant democracy. Tenants elect the board of their housing project, which is responsible for property management and financial governance, and tenant representatives elect a board for the nonprofit housing organization that could own more than one project. Franz told us tenant democracy has been a key factor in ensuring tenure security and helping the sector withstand the trend towards housing privatization and commodification.
So on the one hand that they're independent, but also how they are structured is that they are very multi-layered and that they have quite a democratic element with regards to how they're controlled. So they have resident boards that are elected, and it's this kind of democratic nature, and this idea of tenant democracy is very, very important. You need to have those structures in place, but then also how accessible are those structures to everyone, and how do we make sure that people who are kind of subject to those structures are actually in control of them? Those housing associations. It's become quite a side of struggle with regards to that ghetto law of who actually sits on those boards, who are they talking for? Are they talking for the residents or not? So I'm not saying this is like perfect, and this is obviously sides of struggle, as I said. But the fact that it is kind of a very it's not just that they are independent from the state, it's also that they are sort of, at least, in its kind of ideal situation, democratically controlled to a certain extent by the tenants.
Hanan, now that we've explored the Danish model, let's turn back to Canada. In our previous episode, we highlighted some innovative practices that can overcome some of the barriers to preserving and expanding community housing.
Yeah, we talked about access to land as one barrier, and speaking of that, community land trust is an interesting model for land value capturing and sharing.
Certainly. For those unfamiliar with the term, community land trusts, or CLTs, are nonprofit organizations that obtain ownership or control of the land, which can happen through donations, purchases, or long-term land leases from the government. The trust preserves the land for community use and benefit. Some land trusts are set aside as nature preserves, and others are used in urban settings to create affordable housing or space for nonprofits and small businesses or community amenities. In those cases, CLTs can own a building on the land and lease it to a nonprofit housing organization, or the building can be owned directly by a nonprofit organization. The governance models vary, but they typically use participatory democracy practices.
I think community land trusts, are very promising. And if you look across the country, they're more common in some regions or parts of the country than they are in others. But essentially, the idea here is to transfer private land into community ownership to preserve affordability. And they can be one way that land can be set aside, protected, and provided to community housing providers who are working to develop nonprofit and non-market housing.
A 2023 study of Canadian CLTs showed there were 41 active CLTs in Canada at the time. These CLTs hold nearly 10,000 housing units, including 60% that are non-equity cooperatives, 40% as nonprofit rentals, and 3% that are homeownership units.
CLTs can play an important role in addressing colonialism and racism in the housing system. According to the same study, Black people, Indigenous people, and racialized minorities have been active in CLT leadership, and most CLT organizations identify racial equity and justice as a key value of their work.
Hogan's Alley Society is often cited as a successful model for redressing historical and racial injustices, in this case, the displacement of Vancouver's Black population. Natasha, maybe you can guide us through our conversation with Djaka Blais about Hogan's Alley Society?
Sure. Hogan's Alley is a neighborhood adjacent to downtown Vancouver. It was home to Vancouver's largest group of Black residents. Then, beginning in the 1930s on through the 70s, the community was displaced by municipal actions, including demolitions and freeway construction. The freeway project was eventually cancelled due to citizen protest, but not before the neighborhood was destroyed by the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts that were built over it. In 2017, the city decided to remove the viaducts and redevelop the area. The Hogan's Alley Society was then formed as a nonprofit organization seeking redress for the displacement of the Black community. Djaka told us more in detail.
Hogan's Alley Society is dedicated to revitalizing the historic Black presence in Hogan's Alley, as well as daylighting Black communities more broadly in Metro Vancouver. Our mission is to ensure that Black communities are not only remembered, but also provided with the housing they need, fostering a more inclusive and equitable city. The organization came out of community advocacy to really get the city to recognize and acknowledge the historical Black presence in Vancouver. And those conversations, there was work done to raise awareness and do public education by various community members around the historical Black presence. And when the city started talking about removing the Georgia and Dunsmuir viaducts, which actually go through Hogan's Alley presently, community members, advocated for the city to acknowledge that historical Black presence and to offer some form of cultural redress. So that led to the formation of the Hogan's Alley Working Group, and which informed the city's planning in the development of the Northeast False Creek Plan, and was one of the first municipal policies to actually in North America to actually speak to cultural redress. And it spoke to cultural redress to First Nations, to Chinatown, as well as to the Black community. And so more specifically, the redress for the Black community was within the context of the Hogan's Alley block. And with the intention of removing that block, conversations began around establishing a community land trust that would be able to hold developments that would cater to the needs of Black communities in particular. And so Hogan's Alley Society was formed to be able to negotiate with the city around those developments and to ultimately be able to hold and operate those developments. We have our 3 strategic pillars. So we are looking at culturally informed housing operations, as well as development of affordable housing and social infrastructure that meets the needs of Black communities. And then we're also focused on helping build the Black community through research, public education, and community building. In terms of our wraparound supports, that's really entrenched within our community care program, which ultimately is looking at building a stronger sense of community.
The Hogan's Alley Society takes a community land trust model to steward the land and oversee community development, with the goal of ensuring long-term affordability and resisting gentrification pressures.
We're in the process of establishing a community land trust that will hold the developments and properties in order to protect the affordability of those developments for the long term, as well as to prevent further displacements of those communities, as well as retaining kind of the intention of those developments. In 2022, we signed a memorandum of understanding with the City of Vancouver to be able to enter into a long-term lease for the development of the Hogan's Alley block, once they remove the Georgia and Dudsmuir viaducts, which are currently going through that block. That MOU was signed as a form of cultural redress for the displacement of the Black community members in Vancouver's first Black community in Hogan's Alley. And the developments will deliver a Black cultural center, significant amount of affordable housing, space for small businesses, as well as childcare spaces and other potential amenities for the community. And really our focus there is creating a cultural hub for the Black community in Vancouver that's connected to surrounding Black communities in other municipalities in Metro Vancouver. Our intention is to acquire additional properties to become part of the community land trust so that we can continue to provide additional affordable housing that is really tailored to the needs of the communities that we're serving, and looking to do that in various ways through different partnerships with other housing providers and other service providers as well. So currently we're in a partnership to operate Nora Hendricks Place, which is a 52-unit temporary modular supportive housing building. It's actually located on the Hogan's Alley block, and it is the first supportive housing building in the province to prioritize both Black and Indigenous community members at risk of homelessness. The program does also use a harm reduction lens to its offerings, and Hogan's Alley Society provides more specifically the cultural and wellness supports as an add-on support to and wraparound supports for the residents of the building. We're also in the process of acquiring other properties to develop and provide affordable housing, which meets the unique needs and interests of the Black community in Metro Vancouver.
The Hogan's Alley CLT model is about more than housing. It's also about land reclamation and asserting decision-making control over land. This would allow the Hogan's Alley Society to leverage the land held in trust to build and preserve social, economic, and cultural assets for Black and other equity-seeking communities.
There's a significant lack of access to infrastructures, to space, even for Black communities to deliver programming that they're offering on a consistent basis, to be able to afford the spaces that are out there. And so one of our objectives is really to develop additional assets for the community that are designed and built with the Black community in mind. So they're open to broader community, but really taking that lens of what is going to be suitable for the specific needs of Black communities. And Nora Hendricks Place was the first development in that sense, in that it is located specifically on the Hogan's Alley block. And so when the city was looking to put up these various temporary modular housings to help address the housing crisis, one of the municipal owned lands was this the block, because there is a green space alongside of where the viaducts go through it. And since the city was already in a relationship with Hogan's Alley Society around the negotiations for the block itself, that's when we were invited to participate in the operations of Nora Hendricks Place. So that became one of the first assets, although we are not holding that asset, but we're definitely involved in the design of the building, as well as the design of the garden that is housed at Nora Hendricks Place, and really ensured that the designs did incorporate some either Afrocentric principles or also took into account what would be suitable to supporting Black community members. And so developing assets that are really catering and targeting the needs of Black communities is unique in our province. There's not that many organizations to date that have been able to do that, and we want to see more organizations being able to do that. And we're continuing to advance in order to build our capacity to be able to deliver more.
The Hogan's Alley Society's approach to land trust emphasizes building both tangible and intangible assets, such as affordable housing, cultural amenities, social enterprises, and spaces for small businesses.
Yeah, I think you're touching on the fact that there's like tangible and intangible assets that we're looking to build. So in terms of like tangible, it's like physical structures, whether it's homes that are various designs that have various levels of affordability, as well as social infrastructure like space for programming, a cultural center, but as well space for businesses and for nonprofits to operate. We're also looking at within housing that there is adaptability and flexibility for home-based businesses, that can really support the various levels of entrepreneurship that exists within our community. The intangible assets, we're really looking to help contribute to some of those that were lost when the community was displaced. So when the community in Hogan's Alley was displaced, and in particular for the Black community's displacement, it wasn't just the loss of the physical structures like the homes and businesses that people had built, but it was the loss of the social, political, and cultural capital that had been developed within the community. And as people kind of dispersed and went to various other municipalities, other provinces, other countries, we lost those bonds that had been built among the community. And decades since, we haven't seen another kind of hub or nucleus for the Black community in Vancouver recreate. And so that's our key focus, is helping to recreate a hub, both intangibly through connections and partnerships, but also tangibly through a physical location that can draw and attract people to it.
Listening to the story of the Hogan's Alley Society, it sounds like community land trusts are a promising model for affordable housing stewardship and community economic development. We also learned about another emerging housing approach, social enterprises, and how they can help build new community assets and resist the erosion of existing ones.
That's right, Hanan. As government funding agreements expire, many housing nonprofits are compelled to explore new revenue streams, though this requires having an entrepreneurial mindset or spirit. When social enterprises are run by housing organizations, the profits generated by the enterprises are reinvested to support affordable housing and other community services. One successful example is Namerind Housing Corporation, an Indigenous-led housing organization located in Regina. Can you tell our listeners about our conversation with Robert Byers, who is Namerind's president and CEO?
Absolutely. Namerind is not only a housing provider, but also the official community entity for the Government of Canada's Reaching Home homelessness strategy in Regina. That means Namerind administers the Reaching Home funding, which is used to reduce homelessness. Let's first hear from Robert about the organization's early steps towards launching a social enterprise.
When I first started here back in 2005, we were operating under what they call the Urban Native Housing Program. And we did at that time receive a subsidy in the amount of, it was around $2.1 or $2.2 million per year. But it was declining, and it was declining quite rapidly. And we thought, we've got to get ready for this. And so one of the first things we did is we did an inventory of our housing. And, back then we had about 75 of our units were really just didn't make very good business sense to invest in the repair. And, with the declining subsidy, we thought maybe we can sell some of these houses and repurpose that money and repurpose it into, I would say, a renovation plan that would where we would upgrade the types of materials that we would use. We could invest in things that would make more or better economic sense, such as apartment buildings or townhomes that were closer together, because our places were scattered single dwelling units all over the city. And, that's costly to maintain. So we started investing in those types of things, and including I guess at the time we didn't really know what to call it, but businesses that would bring in a different type of revenue stream. So, but we certainly didn't think of calling it social enterprise, even though I think we thought we did. Our goal really was to be a self-sustaining, affordable housing provider. We still believe that the government, all orders of government have to be involved, but that'll be the bonus. For us to be self-sustaining was our goal.
Now, the social enterprise model has not only supported their housing mandate, but also allowed them to create jobs and wealth, encourage business startups, and create a sense of ownership for the Indigenous community.
You know, we reached out to Indigenous folks that were providing a service to working with other organizations, whether it was carpentry or electrical or painters. We said, why don't you form your own company? You know, get a GST number, get your workers' compensation number, form your company, and be a part of Namerind. We have a 10-year plan to renovate our homes. You can be a part of that plan. And I think when we're done, there's going to be more renovations to do, but you'll be an established organization, and I'm sure you'll be doing work for other people. As it turns out, that is how it went. And I think we were all lucky. And two of those organizations continue to do work for us, not just us, but for other organizations as well. And they're established. And, you know, that was a big step. And I think that's what allowed us to, I would say, invest in other social enterprises and for them to be supportive of it. After we had bought like townhouses and such, we thought, you know, we've talked with the contractors that work for us, and they said we were so important to them. We were so important to their families. And, you know, we thought, but you guys are so important to us. And anyway, that led us to purchasing a warehouse with almost a full city block attached to it. And we rented them space. Now, not only did it help us pay for the warehouse, but it also brought us all closer together because they then knew that they say we're important to them. Now they know how important they are to us because we wanted our people to all work together under one roof. They didn't have to operate out of a trailer. They could actually go to their spot in the warehouse and that was theirs. And it really brought a sense of ownership, not only to what we all own, but to our housing, to our homes. Right? People really cared about it. And I would say that to the point where even on days off, we had contractors driving by our places and making sure everything was good.
Today, besides their warehouse, Namerind's for-profit businesses include property management services, a retail mall, and a pharmacy. They reinvested profits into affordable housing and local communities in Regina.
When I first started, we would give somebody a rundown house and ask them to treat it like gold. And we would wonder why they wouldn't. And anyways, what we did is we thought, you know, if we can provide people with a home that they can be proud of, then we can be a part of changing that whole cycle of, you know, living in community housing that has not the greatest reputation. And, you know, after school, the little kids will be like, well, let's go to your place. We wanted the kids in our families to say, let's come to my place. We wanted to give them a home that they could be proud of. And honestly, it did work. It worked for us. And you know, I think because of those successes, then we got brave. You know, and we said, okay, you know, there's a mall for sale. Let's see if we can buy this mall. And you know, I remember, you know, we bought a mall. And in there, our anchor tenant was a community clinic. And we thought, well, never been to a clinic really where there wasn't a pharmacy. So we thought, okay, we need to put in a pharmacy. Now, when you're not a pharmacist, that's pretty challenging. So we had to, you know, I had to go to my board and say, look, we need to have a board that is a majority pharmacists. I'll represent Namerind. We'll find a couple of licensed pharmacists that can make up the board. And so we started, we fly under the Pharma Choice banner. We met with a prescription drug supplier and to convince all of these folks that how this, like, one of the questions was, what has this got to do with housing and affordable housing? And once we explained to them really what we wanted to do, they became actually, I would say, huge cheerleaders for us. And when we first started the pharmacy, we had the first 2 years were really slow and really hard, to where now we have 2 full-time pharmacists, 2 full-time pharmacy technicians, and a part-time. And I guess it doesn't matter, but it brings in over $500,000 in revenue to Namerind Housing that we can put towards affordable housing. It's like the rents for our mall. All that goes back into supporting affordable housing. And since our contractors have sort of moved on and expanded their own organizations, we have now taken over the whole warehouse and the lots. And so we've invested in skid steers and front end loaders and dump trucks and such. And we provide property management for many other organizations. That brings in revenue that all goes towards affordable housing.
The social enterprise model brings flexibility and autonomy for Namerind to serve their community better.
When I look at government programs, they have a program and you have to make your project fit theirs. What we've done and what social enterprises allowed us to do is to invest in projects or things that will help us as an organization. What can we do to provide a service? So even like with our pharmacy, we work with other community-based organizations and nonprofit organizations, and we provide them with prescription drug strategies or their needs, right?
It's not only the social enterprise model that made Namerind successful. The fact that they provide Indigenous-led housing is also key, and something that benefits all Canadians.
When Indians are looking after Indians, nobody cares. But when Indians are responsible for the community, everybody cares. Because when like I was saying, for this Reaching Home strategy, we were one of 3 organizations in all of Canada that was responsible for both funding streams. And that changed the working relationship with the other orders of government, with just organizations as a whole. It changed. We've now been the community entity for just about 4 years now, and it's changed. People are starting to support us now. They're starting to realize that we're doing a good job, that, we're smart, we can make decisions, we don't need their approval. We're working on a community plan that doesn't need this person's approval or that person's approval. We can do it as a community. We're getting Indigenous and non-Indigenous people to work together to solve or reduce homelessness because it's a community concern. It shouldn't be a Namerind concern or a City of Regina concern. It should be a community concern.
The stories of Namerind and Hogan's Alley are truly inspiring. They showcase successful Black-led and Indigenous-led housing solutions, and it's interesting how they each take a different approach.
Indeed, Natasha, and these approaches could easily be complementary. Nonprofit housing organizations that want to be social entrepreneurs could form a CLT or work with CLTs to provide housing and other community resources. Both approaches could help nonprofit housing organizations achieve their social and housing goals while ensuring they or their communities retain control over housing and development.
These examples show a lot of promise, but how could we scale up successful initiatives like these? For small organizations like Hogan's Alley Society that serve marginalized communities, figuring out the financial aspects and lining up for the necessary resources can be daunting.
As a relatively newer organization, a lot of advocacy had to go and continues to need to go into building the case for the need for culturally informed programming and housing. There's still, I think, a predominance of wanting to support existing, more established organizations that have greater capacity with limited understanding of the actual impact that services like ours that are more tailored can have on individuals. Our our capacity limitations mean that we're only able to support a limited number of people. And I think sometimes when you have funders that will take a value for money approach to assessing a funding, some of them may be challenged to see, are we getting our value for money in the number of people that are being supported with this program if they're not seeing the full picture of what's actually being offered for these individuals.
These challenges require multi-sectoral, multi-level collective efforts to solve. The Danish example provides a model of an alternative community housing system where assets and resources are pooled and managed through an overarching nonprofit agency supported by public institutions. Some large CLTs in Canada have played a similar central role in acquiring, managing, and preserving land and property for community use. Both Joshua and Robert highlight that by sharing resources, knowledge, and support, the community housing sector can bolster its resilience and sustainability, even in the face of financial and regulatory hurdles.
So what I'm seeing in the community, in conversations with different groups, is that while municipalities and while much of our planning processes are really orientated or geared towards large organizations that can bring a lot of expertise and experience to the development process, smaller groups, community-led groups, face enormous hurdles if they want to come together and, say, for instance, combine some capital, buy a site and develop some cooperative housing. It's very hard for smaller groups to navigate that process. So, one of the things I'm really interested in is looking at how we can assist and empower some of those community-led and collaborative housing initiatives, particularly ones that include co-housing, which I think is really promising approach.
One of the things that I try and get people to, I guess I shouldn't say understand, but listen to me talk. And I tell them that the money for nonprofits and community-based organizations is shrinking. And even if it's not shrinking, say it's staying the same, but the needs are growing. What can we do? Well, I think one of the solutions is to invest in other community-based organizations. If you provide a service that I need, I want you to provide it for me and I'll pay you for it. Then it keeps that money in the circle and it'll allow us not only to provide that service, but to grow. And I just, that myth that I think community-based or nonprofit organizations sit around waiting for funding is changed. Where there's a lot of hardworking people involved that are always trying to fulfill a need and provide a service to the people that we serve. Like we say, it's our goal is to, or our job is to keep people in their homes. And what can we do to do that? And that's to try and keep their rents low and to provide as much support to them as we can.
For all housing solutions, we should continue to combat racism and decolonize the housing system. Our guests told us that community-based, equity-promoting approaches is key to achieving these goals.
Funding programs that have been offered for Black communities over the last few years often have just been a shifting of an existing funding program and then saying that it's kind of carved out for the Black community with limited kind of actual adjustment to recognize the needs of the organizations that are serving Black communities. So we want to see targeted and sustained investments in Black-led community housing organizations. We want to see investment in community land trusts and cooperative housing and other community ownership models. We want to see an increase in disaggregated race-based data collection and implementation to inform policy development. We really support the development of a community housing acquisition fund, especially with a lens of supporting Black-led and other communities, equity-seeking communities. We want to see, the provision of funding by all levels of government to build culturally appropriate housing, as well as incentivizing nonprofit housing providers and developers to prioritize purpose-built rental housing for Black communities specifically, and the creation of anti-discriminatory housing policies, as well as the creation and evaluation of housing policies that are informed by Black-led advisory groups specifically, and just more broadly for Black-owned housing corporations and Black-led housing nonprofits.
We've been working with Niganan Housing Ventures, which is an Indigenous-led housing organization in Edmonton. We've been researching their housing program called Omamu Wango Gamik. And this is a multi-generational supportive housing initiative. It consists of a mix of townhomes and apartments, as well as some shared communal spaces. And importantly, it also has some on-site staff and programming. And what I find so important about this program is, and what we're learning through our research, is that it's an example of the assertion of Indigenous sovereignty in housing program design and delivery. We're really seeing how this is resisting processes of Indigenous dispossession in the city. It's doing this by reconnecting people to stable housing, reconnecting people to land and culture, and in really profound ways, reconnecting people to their children and their family members. And so we're really talking about changed lives that's occurring in the context of this very important kind or type of community housing.
You know, when I think of what we do at Namerind, and when there's something new or important or just really not even sure the word to use, but something that's really significant to us, we always start with ceremony and prayer. From there, that's what we go. And we do this behind closed doors with our staff and an elder, and then we build on that. And I really believe that it's felt by the people we serve. You know, it's more than just a poster on the wall, right? We want that when people come in, they know they're in an Indigenous organization and it's Indigenous people serving them, and they're not judged. We just need to know some stuff so that we can help them. You know, we're starting to reach out and work with First Nations that are close by so we can understand what's happening there and why people are coming here, and they can understand what's happening to their people when they come here. And even though we all know stuff, it'll be nice to work together. The sharing of information, the sharing of thoughts, I really think that's the only way that we're going to reduce homelessness. I think it's the only way we're going to affect people's lives in a good way.
Well, Natasha, I think Robert's powerful words are a great place to wrap up our last episode, as well as the special series.
Yeah, what a journey. Hopefully, this special series provides some food for thought for our listeners out there about the future of community housing. A heartfelt thank you to all for joining us as we learned. We appreciate your support and engagement.
Yes, thank you all so much for joining us on this journey, and stay tuned for more updates and future episodes from the IRPP Policy Options podcast.
Thank you for tuning into Demystifying Community Housing, a special series from the Policy Options podcast. The production of this podcast series was led by Professors Yushu Ju and Meg Holden at Simon Fraser University, as part of the Community Housing Canada project and the Housing Inequality in Canada project, in collaboration with the IRPP. This episode has been a collective effort with production support and assistance by me, Ricardo Montrose, Claire Desjardins, Luc Monesson, all from the IRPP, and audio production by Jackie Gallant. If you like what you heard and you want to know more about the Institute for Research on Public Policy, head over to irpp.org. As we move through this work exploring policy solutions to increase access to community housing across diverse geographies, it's important to recognize the ancestral territories that we're on. We're grateful for the opportunity to work on these lands. To our listeners, we encourage you to visit native-land.ca to identify the Indigenous territories you're on and acknowledge the land's Indigenous heritage. For additional resources and information recommended to and referred to by our guest speakers, be sure to check our show notes and the episode description. This was Ricardo Montrose. Thank you for listening.